It started as a night no one in the town of Mill Creek, Pennsylvania, would ever forget, not because of what they celebrated, but because of what they lost. It was June 14th, 2008, the night after graduation, when 6 teenagers close friends since childhood gathered around a bonfire at the edge of town. There was laughter, cheap beer, and the sound of fireworks echoing faintly from the valley below. It was supposed to be their last night together before life pulled them in different directions: college, jobs, the military. For once, they weren't thinking about the future. They were just being young. The group included Evan Blake, the quiet one who had just enlisted; Jesse Moore, whose smile was almost always followed by an eye roll; Ty and Connor Daniels, twin brothers known for pushing boundaries; Hannah Lee, the class valedictorian; and Megan Duffy, the shy girl with a disposable camera hanging around her neck. They had been inseparable since middle school, bonded by small-town boredom and shared history. That night, when someone suggested taking the old quarry road home, no one argued. It would shave 20 minutes off the drive, and besides, everyone said the stories about Miller Quarry were just that, stories. For generations, the quarry had been a scar on the landscape, a maze of flooded pits, abandoned machinery, and forgotten shafts. It closed in the early 1980 seconds after a series of accidents, but the locals still whispered about it. They said people heard things there after, dark metallic echoes, lights that flickered beneath the water, and sometimes voices. Most just dismissed it as the wind cutting through the hollow rock. Others stayed away completely. Around 12:47 a.m., Evan's truck and Connor's van pulled off from the gravel lot where the bonfire had burned out. One of the remaining friends, a girl named Lydia Reeves, remembered watching their taillights disappear over the ridge and joking, "Hope they don't run into the ghosts of Miller Quarry." Nobody laughed. By morning, those words would feel like a curse. When parents woke up to find their kids hadn't returned, they assumed it was a late-night hangout or a prank. By noon, when none of the 6 answered calls or texts, worry set in. The police began by tracing their last known locations. Within hours, both vehicles were found at the same spot, parked side by side at the quarry's north entrance. Engines cold, doors unlocked. Inside, everything was undisturbed. Purses, wallets, snacks, and 2 cell phones were sitting in plain view. Megan's disposable camera lay on the dashboard, half used. It was as if the group had stepped out for a moment and simply never came back. Search teams arrived that same afternoon. Locals volunteered, forming lines through the surrounding woods while divers descended into the quarry's flooded basins. They found fragments of old machinery, tires, and twisted rebar, but no signs of the missing. The quarry's floor was uneven, its pits plunging deeper than sonar could reach in places. Every attempt to map the area came back distorted by sediment and shifting debris. The first night of the search brought heavy rain. It poured for nearly 36 hours straight, turning dirt roads into rivers and washing away tracks before investigators could even photograph them. When the skies finally cleared, the quarry looked different. New water lines, collapsed embankments, fresh layers of silt covering whatever clues might have been there. The town of Mill Creek changed almost overnight. Flyers went up on telephone poles, church doors, gas stations. Candlelight vigils filled the high school gym. Parents who once waved to each other at Little League games now avoided eye contact, each wondering if their children had done something reckless, something that couldn't be undone. The sheriff's department set up a command post near the quarry, but as days turned into weeks, hope began to erode. Lydia, the friend who hadn't gone that night, became a quiet fixture at the edge of every search effort. She was the last person to see them alive, and that fact seemed to haunt her. In interviews, she said they hadn't been drinking much, that everyone seemed fine, tired, maybe, but not impaired. The only strange thing, she admitted. The fog came in fast, she said. One minute it was clear, and then it just rolled over the trees like smoke. Rumors spread quickly in the vacuum left by silence. Some said the teens had run away, crossed state lines to start new lives. Others whispered about an underground network of tunnels beneath the quarry, left over from the mining days, and how people had gone missing there before. The sheriff, David Renner, dismissed those theories publicly, but even he couldn't explain how 6 people vanished without leaving a single footprint, shoe, or phone call behind. 2 weeks after the disappearance, a local volunteer diver named Chris Malloy surfaced from the main pit shaking uncontrollably. He said he had seen something, a shadow, moving against the current, but when asked to describe it, he broke down. He never dove again. The quarry earned a new nickname that summer, the Hollow. For months, search dogs, drones, and state police combed every inch of it. They brought in cadaver dogs from Ohio, sonar scanners from Pittsburgh, even volunteer psychics at one point. Nothing helped. Each search only ended with more questions. Parents began to turn on one another, desperate for someone to blame. Some accused the sheriff's office of incompetence. Others suspected one of the teens had done something terrible and the rest paid the price. Every family had their version of what happened that night, but none of them matched. By late August, the official investigation was scaled back. Missing posters started to curl at the corners. The news crews left. The quarry entrance was resealed with concrete barriers. For a while, the town tried to move on, but the grief didn't fade. It hardened. Mill Creek became a place defined by its silence. Every year on June 14th, the parents gathered near the barricade with candles, each year fewer than before. Lydia always came standing a little apart, her head down, as if waiting for something, some sound, some sign that the quarry would finally give them back. In a place where even echoes died fast, the truth was buried deeper than anyone could imagine, and 17 years later, it would finally rise. From the very beginning, the investigation felt uncertain, like everyone was guessing at something they couldn't quite see. The morning after the 16s vanished, the Mill Creek Sheriff's Department set up a command post near the quarry's northern access road. By afternoon, the Pennsylvania State Police had joined in, turning the quiet stretch of farmland into a hive of flashing lights, generators, and search tents. Reporters arrived within a day, and by nightfall, national headlines had already christened it the Miller Quarry mystery. At first, authorities leaned on the simplest explanation: the teens had drowned. It was common sense. Their cars were parked near the flooded basin, and the quarry was notoriously deep, some parts dropping over 200 feet. The water was dark and cold, fed by underground springs that shifted with the weather. If the group had tried to explore or swim and slipped in, the current could have pulled them under instantly. That theory calmed the public, at least for a while. But as the days dragged on and no bodies surfaced, the confidence behind it began to crumble. Dive teams came from as far as Pittsburgh. They used side-scan sonar, underwater drones, even weighted grids to map out each trench. But the bottom of the quarry wasn't flat, it was jagged and unstable, filled with collapsed stone and metal debris from decades of mining. Visibility below 10 feet was nearly zero. Divers described the water as liquid blackness. After a week, they still hadn't found a single trace. No clothing, no phones, no tire fragments, no sign that anyone had been there at all. When search efforts stalled, investigators shifted to other theories. Maybe the teens had run away. The timing right after graduation fit the narrative. 6 kids, eager to escape small-town life, disappearing into the night together. It had happened before in other places, but nothing in their lives supported it. Their bank accounts remained untouched. Their phones last pinged at 12:54 a.m., right at the quarry entrance. None of them had bought bus tickets or withdrawn cash. They had made plans for college, for jobs, for the future. Running didn't make sense. Still, police needed something to tell the families. Sheriff David Renner labeled it a probable accident in his early statements, even while privately admitting to colleagues that it didn't add up. That inconsistency would haunt the investigation for years. A week later, a man came forward, a part-time security guard for a construction site 2 miles away. He claimed he'd seen headlights moving near the pit around 2 a.m., the night the teens vanished. He described the lights weaving back and forth as if someone was lost or searching for something. It was the first promising lead. But when investigators followed up, his story began to unravel. In his second interview, the time changed. In the third, the direction of the lights changed. When asked to take a polygraph, he refused. Rumors spread that he had been drinking that night, and soon, his statement was quietly filed away as unreliable. By late summer, frustration hardened into desperation. Parents, convinced the sheriff's office wasn't doing enough, began hiring their own help, private investigators, cadaver dog handlers, even retired detectives who specialized in cold cases. They combed through property records, interviewed ex-quarry workers, and examined decades-old safety reports. One private diver, Grant Walters, claimed there were sealed tunnels beneath the main pit, old service shafts from before the quarry shut down. But state officials denied access, citing structural danger. Walters returned twice on his own dime, dropping sonar equipment illegally into the water. The data he pulled up showed faint, geometric shapes, possibly walls or chambers, but they were too deep to confirm. As the story gained traction online, theories began to multiply. Some insisted it was a drug deal gone wrong, citing the isolated location and lack of struggle. Others believed the quarry held a collapsed cave system, and the teens had accidentally fallen through. The most unsettling rumor came from local churchgoers, whispers that the quarry had once been used for ritual gatherings in the 1970 seconds, back when 3 other people had vanished from the same stretch of land. There were even claims that one of the teens had been obsessed with exploring those tunnels, bringing maps and flashlights to the bonfire that night. But none of it could be proven. The case consumed the town and then turned on itself. Families who once grieved together stopped speaking. There were arguments at community meetings, accusations in the grocery store aisles, and open hostility toward the sheriff's department. Reporters, sensing blood, kept the story alive for ratings. Cable networks aired specials with titles like The Curse of Miller Quarry and The 6 Lost Teens. Psychics appeared on morning shows, claiming to feel the presence of the kids underwater. None of it led anywhere. By autumn, even law enforcement began to withdraw. Funding dried up. State search units left. The quarry was declared an area of environmental instability, fenced off, and locked under state jurisdiction. Sheriff Renner retired a year later under pressure, and a new name took over the investigation, Detective Mark Ellison. Ellison wasn't from Mill Creek. He'd transferred from Pittsburgh after a failed marriage and too many sleepless nights on homicide duty. The quarry case became his project, his obsession. Where others saw an accident, he saw something deliberate. The evidence or lack of it gnawed at him. 6 people didn't just vanish. Someone had made them disappear. He started by re-interviewing the families, looking for inconsistencies the first team might have missed. But after months of listening to grief on repeat, he realized the pain had already blurred memories. Parents contradicted themselves. Friends couldn't agree on who rode in which car. The disposable camera found in the van was developed, but most of the photos were ordinary smiling faces, headlights, a few blurry shots of trees and sky. The last frame showed what looked like the quarry's north ridge, taken from inside a vehicle. Beyond that, nothing. In the years that followed, Ellison kept revisiting the site on his own time. He said it helped him think. The area changed, new growth covering old trails, rust reclaiming what was left of the machinery, but he could still see the outlines of where the cars had been parked. He would stand there at night, flashlight in hand, listening to the water. Some nights, when the wind was still, he swore he could hear an echo, a faint metal scrape, like something shifting far below the surface. As the investigation faded from headlines, life moved on for everyone else, but not for him. Each June, he drove back to Mill Creek for the anniversary vigil, usually standing apart from the families, watching from his car. He told colleagues he couldn't let it go because there were too many missing variables. But privately, he admitted he felt something different, a sense that whatever happened that night had left a mark on the place itself. By 2015, the Miller Quarry case was officially declared inactive. The files were boxed, archived, and labeled unsolved. But Ellison never stopped visiting. He kept a map pinned to his apartment wall, marked with every lead, every interview, every failed dive. It became less an investigation and more a haunting. And then, one summer 17 years later, a storm unlike anything the region had seen in decades hit southern Pennsylvania. It tore through valleys, flooded highways, and sent millions of gallons of water surging through the quarry basin. When the rain finally stopped, the quarry looked different again, drained, scarred, and strangely exposed. Within a week, hikers would stumble across something glinting in the mud, something metallic, something out of place. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the Miller Quarry would give something back. By the summer of 2025, Mill Creek had learned to live around its scars. The old quarry had become a ghost of a place choked with reeds, quiet except for the wind moving across stagnant water. 17 years had passed since the 6 teenagers vanished, and for most people, the mystery had hardened into memory. The families had moved away or grown old. The investigation had long been boxed, stored, and forgotten. Then, in June, the skies broke open. A storm rolled across southern Pennsylvania with no warning, black clouds piling like mountains, thunder shaking the valley. In less than 2 hours, 9 inches of rain fell. Creeks flooded, hillsides collapsed, roads disappeared under brown water. For the first time in decades, the drainage system beneath Miller Quarry couldn't hold. The deluge tore through its edges, carving new paths where none had existed before. When the storm finally cleared 3 days later, the landscape looked almost alien. The quarry's deepest basin, once a mirror-flat surface of still, dark water, had partially drained. Whole sections of limestone now jutted up from the mud like broken teeth. The lower pool was reduced to a field of slick clay and twisted debris, sunlight glinting off, pockets of standing water. On a Sunday morning, a group of hikers cutting through the nearby ridge noticed something metallic sticking out of the earth. At first, they thought it was part of the old mining equipment, maybe a crane or fuel drum exposed by the storm. But when one of them climbed down the embankment, he realized it wasn't machinery at all. It was the roof of a vehicle crushed, rusted, half buried in the mud. The faint outline of a windshield could still be seen, coated in layers of grit. Within hours, local authorities sealed off the area. The discovery spread through town faster than any official report could be written. By that evening, news crews were already back at the gates. Some of the same parents who had stood there 17 years earlier now returned with white hair and trembling hands. It was as if time had rewound, but this time, the quarry wasn't silent. Recovery crews arrived the next morning with cranes and floodlights. It took nearly 12 hours of excavation to pull the vehicle free. When it finally emerged, the shape was unmistakable. A white Ford Econoline van, caked in black mud but intact enough to read the rusted plate. The numbers matched the registration of the van owned by Connor Daniels, the same van the 16s had driven into the quarry that night. Investigators worked quietly, as families stood behind the barrier tape. Some cried, others just stared. The van's windows were shattered inward, as if the vehicle had been crushed by pressure, not impact. The side door had caved in, and both rear tires were gone, stripped clean from the rims. Inside, what they found turned 17 years of silence into something heavier than grief. 4 sets of skeletal remains were recovered from the van's interior, 2 in the front seats, 2 in the back. They were jumbled together, held in place by collapsed metal and layers of sediment. Personal effects were still visible. A rusted class ring, the frame of a camera, fragments of denim, and the remains of a canvas sneaker that matched one of the missing teens' descriptions. But the forensic count was clear: there were only 4, not 6. 2 were still missing. The discovery hit the families like a second funeral. For years, they had prayed for closure, but now that it was here, it felt cruelly incomplete. The media swarmed the story, branding it the van beneath the quarry. Old footage resurfaced, showing the teens smiling at graduation, frozen in time. Interviews with aging parents filled the evening news. Some thanked God for answers. Others said it was worse than never knowing. Detective Mark Ellison, now in his 60s, came out of retirement to observe the scene. He stood just beyond the caution tape, his face expressionless as workers sifted through the van. For him, this was personal. He'd spent half his career chasing ghosts here, convinced the truth was still somewhere under the water. Now, after all this time, the quarry had given him something, but not enough. The bodies were sent to a forensic lab in Harrisburg for DNA analysis. The process took weeks. Rain and silt had stripped away most identifying tissue, but small fragments, teeth, bone marrow, jewelry, were enough to make partial matches. By early August, results confirmed the remains belonged to Evan Blake, Megan Duffy, Hannah Lee, and Connor Daniels. The Daniels twins, long assumed inseparable, had died together in the same van. When news broke, The town of Mill Creek went quiet again. Candlelight vigils were held in front of the high school gym, just as they had been 17 years earlier. Photos of the 16s appeared on makeshift memorials, two faces still framed with question marks. Their absence hung heavier than any answer could. The families gathered privately at the quarry's overlook one evening, joined by Ellison. It was a somber reunion, people who had once clung to hope, now forced to face its limits. Some brought flowers, others brought silence. Ellison noticed something peculiar while watching the excavation teams finish their work. The van had been lodged deeper than expected, wedged against a slope of compacted rock. Judging by the position, it shouldn't have stayed intact for that long. He had seen cars fall into water before they sank, twisted, tore apart. This one hadn't fallen. It looked as if it had been placed there. Forensics noted something else, a thin coating of silt, layering the undercarriage that didn't match the rest of the basin's sediment. It was older, heavier, as if the vehicle had been buried before the quarry's water levels rose. Ellison couldn't shake the thought that the storm hadn't just uncovered the van. It had peeled back a secret that someone had intentionally hidden. But as the case reopened, the question that dominated every conversation was the same. Where are the other two? Jesse Moore and Ty Daniels, the last missing members of the group, were nowhere near the van. Search dogs combed the newly exposed mudflats for days, picking up faint traces of bone but nothing human. The deeper pits remained unstable, too dangerous to explore. In interviews, Ellison spoke carefully, calling it a breakthrough, not a conclusion. He told reporters that the water had kept the van preserved, which could mean there were still more clues below. But privately, he wondered if the truth had been sitting just beyond their reach all along. As autumn approached, the quarry began to refill naturally, rainwater reclaiming what the storm had taken away. By October, only the top of the excavation trench was visible, a scar fading back into still water. For most of Mill Creek, it marked the end of the story. But for Ellison, it marked the beginning of something else. He spent hours reviewing the photos from the site. The dented roof, the broken headlights, the position of each body. None of it aligned with an accident. Something about it felt deliberate, almost staged. He began revisiting his old notes, tracing the quarry's layout, re-examining the old mining maps that mentioned a sealed service tunnel beneath the East Ridge, a section that had never been searched in 2008 because of structural collapse. That detail had always lingered in the back of his mind, a loose thread he could never pull. Now, with two bodies still unaccounted for, it no longer felt like coincidence. Ellison wasn't ready to let the case close again. Not this time. As the anniversary of the storm approached, he returned once more to the edge of Miller Quarry. The water was calm again, reflecting the gray sky like glass. He stood there in silence, the weight of 17 years and 1,000 unanswered questions pressing against him. Somewhere beneath that surface, he knew, the rest of the truth was waiting, and soon, something else would rise to meet him. Every case we cover takes weeks of research, fact-checking, and long nights connecting the pieces of real lives that were lost. We do it because these stories matter and someone out there still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, please like, subscribe, and share which part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support keeps us going. And for more mysterious and solved cold cases, the links are waiting for you in the description below. Now let's get back to the case. The autopsies took weeks. Each sample, each fragment of bone, was treated like glass. When the results finally came back, the findings tore through every assumption the investigation had leaned on for years. The 4 teens hadn't drowned. Every single one of them had died from blunt force trauma to the head and upper body injuries consistent with a violent assault, not an accident. And what unsettled investigators most was the sequence of fractures. According to the forensic pathologist, the injuries occurred before the bodies entered the water. That detail changed everything. The quarry had long been assumed to be the place they died. But now, it was clear it had been the place they were hidden. The crash, the burial, the van, none of it had been spontaneous. Someone had made a deliberate choice to put them there. When the report landed on Detective Mark Ellison's desk, he was long retired, living alone in a small apartment above a hardware store in Harrisburg. He wasn't supposed to be involved anymore, but the local sheriff's office sent him a copy out of courtesy. The moment he read it, he felt the same jolt he'd felt 17 years earlier when he first walked into that case file. Something inside him told him this was the missing piece. He drove back to Mill Creek the next morning. The town looked different: new roads, closed shops, a fresh layer of years over old pain. The quarry was still sealed, but now surrounded by construction fencing and flood monitoring equipment. A sign warned of unstable terrain, but Ellison ignored it. He stood at the same overlook he had visited so many times before. Only now he knew what those waters had been hiding. The crash hadn't been an accident, it had been a cover. Forensics from the excavation site revealed details that deepened the unease. Underneath the van's final resting place, investigators found tire tracks pressed into compacted silt, old enough to predate the recent flood by years. Soil analysis suggested they had been made when the quarry's water level was far lower, possibly during a dry spell a decade earlier. That meant the vehicle had been moved there deliberately, long after the disappearance. Whoever did it had access, patience, and an intimate understanding of the quarry's shifting landscape. Further lab tests on sediment samples from the van's undercarriage revealed mismatched layers, some older, some newer, indicating the vehicle had been submerged, removed, and repositioned at least once. The more Ellison read, the more one word kept forming in his mind: staged. He met with the new lead investigator, Detective Carla Hensley, a sharp but cautious officer who'd inherited the reopened case. She laid out the evidence in careful order. The scene hadn't been random. The van's angle of entry into the mud wasn't consistent with a natural fall from the ridge. It was too shallow. There were no drag marks above the pit, no signs of a crash impact. It looked like the van had been rolled, slowly, from a ramp or flat surface, then left to sink as the quarry refilled. It was methodical, intentional. When Ellison asked her what that meant, she hesitated before answering. "It means someone came back here years later," she said. "Someone who knew exactly where to hide them." That night, Ellison went back through his old case notes. He spread them across the motel bed. Every photo, every statement, every piece of half-forgotten evidence. One name resurfaced in the pages: a quarry maintenance, to the contractor named Harold Griggs, who had worked at Miller Quarry in the early 2000s. He'd been one of the last employees before it was sold off to the county. His name had come up once, briefly, during the original search when a neighbor mentioned he'd been acting strange after the teens vanished. Back then, it had gone nowhere. Griggs had moved away 2 years later. Ellison dug deeper, calling old contacts. Within days, he learned Griggs had died in 2011, an apparent suicide after a string of theft charges. But what caught Ellison's attention wasn't how he died, it was where. His body had been found near the outskirts of Mill Creek, less than 2 miles from the east ridge of the quarry. He returned to the archives, requesting blueprints from the quarry's operational days. Among the old, brittle maps, one stood out: a 1,979 structural diagram showing a sealed service tunnel running directly beneath the east ridge. It had been marked as unstable after a series of collapses, closed before the quarry's official shutdown. The area had been considered too dangerous to explore during the original search. No one had ever gone back. As Ellison traced the lines of that tunnel on the blueprint, something clicked. The van had been placed near that same ridge. The tire marks found under the silt led in that direction. It was possible, maybe even likely, that the vehicle had been transported from the tunnel before being buried. The location wasn't random. Whoever had staged the crash may have used the tunnel to access the pit unseen. He drove to the ridge the next morning, ignoring the posted warnings. The ground was soft, eroded by the recent storm. He followed the slope until he reached a depression in the hillside, a faint sinkhole surrounded by half-buried concrete. To most, it would have looked like another natural cavity, but Ellison recognized the shape of a sealed entryway. Part of the concrete had cracked open, exposing a sliver of darkness. Beyond, the tunnel was still there. He stood there for a long time, the wind cutting through the trees, the air heavy with the smell of wet limestone. The silence was absolute. In that moment, he wasn't sure whether he wanted to go in or run from it. Something about the place felt wrong, not haunted, but hollow, as if sound itself was swallowed before it could echo back. When he finally reported his findings, the state excavation team was hesitant to act. The structure was too unstable, the ground still shifting from the storm. They agreed to survey it later in the year. But for Ellison, waiting wasn't an option. He felt time pressing in again, the same urgency that had driven him all those years ago. 2 of the 6 were still missing. If the van had been planted there, then whoever did it might have left more behind. He began visiting the site at night, parking his truck near the barrier and walking down with a flashlight. He would stand near the tunnel entrance, listening. Sometimes water dripped steadily inside. Other times the air was so still it seemed the entire quarry was holding its breath. Each visit deepened his conviction that the missing 2 teens hadn't died with the others. Maybe they'd been separated that night, chased, hidden, silenced. Or maybe they had witnessed something they were never meant to see. The possibilities turned over and over in his mind until they blurred into obsession. The official investigation slowed again, bogged down in safety reports and jurisdictional red tape. But Ellison kept pushing. He began speaking with locals who still remembered the quarry's old days, miners, truck drivers, even hunters who'd trespassed after it closed. One elderly former employee mentioned that during the last few years of operation, the East Ridge had been used for dumping equipment after a cave-in. He remembered seeing lights there at night, long after the site had supposedly been shut down. That small detail gave Ellison something to hold on to. If the ridge had been used in secret back then, maybe someone had continued to use it after. Someone familiar with its layout, its blind spots, its hidden routes. Someone who could make 6 people disappear and leave no trace for nearly 2 decades. But as he prepared to push deeper into that theory, a new obstacle emerged. The state ordered the quarry site completely closed again for safety reasons, no further access without authorization. Ellison was furious, but beneath the frustration was something else, fear. He'd spent nearly 2 decades chasing this case, and now that the truth was within reach, part of him wasn't sure he wanted to find it. Because if the evidence pointed to what he suspected, then the quarry wasn't just a place where those teens died. It was a place where someone had come back years later, not to confess but to bury the truth all over again. He drove home that night with the blueprint still open on the passenger seat, tracing a tunnel line over and over with his finger. The 2 names circled at the top of his notes, Jesse Moore and Ty Daniels, stared back at him. 2 kids who had vanished without a trace while their friends were entombed beneath the water. And in the darkness, as rain began to fall against the windshield again, Ellison knew one thing for certain. The storm hadn't been the end of the story. It had been the beginning of something much worse. By late October, the state finally approved limited access to the East Ridge. Weeks of debate, safety inspections, and structural scans had delayed it. But in the end, the evidence beneath that slope couldn't be ignored. The storm had done what 17 years of investigation couldn't. It had exposed part of the truth. The ridge had cracked open, revealing the upper mouth of the old service tunnel that had once run beneath Miller Quarry. The opening was narrow, only a few feet wide, surrounded by fractured concrete and overgrown roots. Archaeologists and police engineers worked side by side to stabilize the area before lowering a small remote drone into the darkness. The footage showed a long, slanted corridor disappearing into the earth, partially flooded, littered with rusted machinery, and lined with timber supports blackened by age. For nearly half a century, the tunnel had been sealed off, forgotten. Now, it had become the center of a mystery that refused to stay buried. Once air quality tests came back safe enough, a joint team of forensic specialists and geologists descended into the passage. The deeper they went, the more the tunnel seemed frozen in time. Old mining carts were still on their rails, their wheels fused with corrosion. Chains hung from the walls like skeletal vines. The air was thick with the scent of wet limestone and decay. Every sound, the drip of water, the grind of boots on stone, echoed too long. About 70 yards in, they reached a collapse zone where the roof had caved decades earlier. Rubble blocked most of the passage, but near the base of the debris, something caught the light. A fragment of fabric. It was denim, frayed and pale from age. When one of the archaeologists brushed away more sediment, they saw it wasn't just fabric. It was a jacket sleeve, still attached to bone. The team froze. Carefully, they began to excavate around the discovery. Within an hour, the full outline emerged. A skeleton slumped against the tunnel wall, one arm raised as if shielding its head. A flashlight still clutched in its hand. Next to it, half buried in the clay, lay a second body, smaller, positioned close beside the first. Both had been trapped under the collapse, preserved in layers of silt and mineral dust. The news reached Detective Mark Ellison before the public announcement did. When he arrived on site that afternoon, he stood near the mouth of the tunnel, watching as stretcher teams emerged from the earth carrying sealed evidence bags. He'd spent nearly 2 decades imagining where Jesse Moore and Ty Daniels might be. Seeing those remains confirmed what he already knew, but it didn't bring the relief he'd expected. Inside the lab, preliminary forensics confirmed the remains belonged to the 2 missing teens. Their bones bore signs of blunt force impact similar to the other 4 but lighter, scattered, almost chaotic, as if caused by debris from the collapse. Still, something didn't sit right. As the recovery team cleared more rubble, they found a dented tire iron half buried beside the skeleton with the denim jacket. Dried traces of blood on the metal matched the same protein structure as that found on the van's interior, a rare coincidence. The working theory took shape quickly. One of the teens had turned violent, possibly during an argument that spiraled out of control. Maybe there had been alcohol, or jealousy, or panic. One swing led to another. The others tried to flee, leading to chaos and tragedy. The fight could have spilled into the tunnel. The collapse might have sealed the last 2 inside. In a moment of shock or fear, someone, maybe one of them, had driven the van into the quarry to cover what had happened. But that explanation only half fit. It was tidy, and Ellison knew tidy answers rarely told the whole story. Forensics continued. They found traces of another compound on the tire iron, old motor oil, and granite dust inconsistent with the tunnel itself. More telling was a single fingerprint found on the flashlight recovered from the first body. It didn't match any of the teens, living or dead. The match came days later from the state database. Harold Griggs, the former quarry maintenance worker. The man Ellison had once suspected, who'd died in 2011. The same man whose name had been buried deep in the old case files. That discovery shattered the clean narrative investigators were starting to build. If Griggs's print was on the flashlight, he'd been there that night or shortly after. Maybe he'd stumbled onto the group after the storm, or found them exploring the tunnels, and something had gone wrong. Griggs had always been known as a quiet, erratic man, and during his employment, he had unrestricted access to the quarry's closed sections. He also had a criminal record: petty theft, trespassing, breaking and entering. It wasn't a stretch to think he might have been lurking around the site long after it closed. But Griggs was dead now, and dead men couldn't answer questions. When the final report was released, it was deliberately vague. Officially, investigators concluded that a physical altercation among the group led to panic, and a partial cave-in killed the remaining 2 teens. The van was later moved, perhaps to conceal the tragedy. The report stopped short of assigning blame. The families were told the case was closed with findings of accidental and associated human error. The parents gathered for a final memorial service at the quarry overlook that November. For the first time in 17 years, all 6 names were spoken together, no longer followed by missing. Closure was supposed to feel peaceful, but instead it felt heavy, almost cruel. There was relief, yes, but also horror, in realizing the story was uglier than anyone had imagined. Ellison stayed apart from the ceremony, standing near the fence line. He knew the official story was only part of the truth. The blood evidence, the misplaced vehicle, the fingerprint, all of it pointed to something that didn't fit the picture of a simple fight among kids. He thought about Griggs, about how easily a man could manipulate evidence when he had years to do it. If the worker had found the bodies, maybe he'd moved them, panicked, or tried to hide his involvement. Maybe the tunnel collapse hadn't been accidental at all. That night, as rain began again over the valley, Ellison sat in his car overlooking the quarry. The headlights illuminated the churned mud, the closed gates, the silence that had haunted this place for nearly 2 decades. He knew he should let it rest. Every report said the case was solved, but he couldn't. Because one question still remained, one that neither forensics nor time could answer. If the quarry worker had found those kids alive, What had he done before the tunnel came down? And in the faint glow of his dashboard, Ellison glanced at the old blueprint one last time. The red ink circled around the east ridge seemed almost a pulse in the low light. The storm had unearthed the dead, but it had also peeled back something deeper, something human, and far more deliberate. In the end, the story came together not through confession, but through time, slow, reluctant, and unmerciful. After months of testing, cross-referencing, and interviews, investigators pieced together what they believed had happened on that long, humid night in June 2008. It was a reconstruction stitched from evidence and conjecture, and a comple, approximation of truth that no one could ever fully confirm. But for most, it was enough. The group's van, the same white Ford Econoline that would one day be pulled from the quarry's depths, had broken down along the service road near the Miller Quarry entrance sometime around 1 in the morning. Cell phone records confirmed that at least 2 of the teens, Hannah Lee and Connor Daniels, had tried to make calls that never went through. The area had always been a dead zone, a pocket of silence where even emergency signals died. Investigators now believed the breakdown had led to tension, maybe fear. They were stranded, tired, and possibly intoxicated after the graduation bonfire. From there, something went wrong. The forensics from the tunnel, the tire iron, and the injuries told fragments of a violent story, an argument that escalated, perhaps over something trivial: who was driving, who said what, or maybe jealousy that had been simmering for weeks. In that moment, emotion became chaos, a swing, a panic, a shout in the dark. 2 of them, Ty Daniels and Jesse Moore, fled into the quarry's old tunnel system, thinking they could find another exit or simply get away from the fight. The others followed, trying to calm them down. None of them understood how dangerous the tunnels really were. When the collapse came, it must have sounded like the world falling apart. The tunnel had been unstable for decades, its supports rotten with moisture. The 2 inside were trapped instantly, crushed under rock and dirt, while the others watched helplessly from the other side. The panic that followed would have been pure hysteria: screaming, confusion, the shock of realizing they couldn't help, that there was nothing they could do. And then, at some point in those hours before dawn, someone else arrived. Forensic analysis on the tire iron and the flashlight had confirmed his presence beyond doubt. Harold Griggs, the former quarry maintenance worker, had been there that night. DNA traces and tool marks matched equipment from the old maintenance sheds he used to frequent. The final theory suggested that Griggs had been living nearby, possibly squatting in one of the abandoned outbuildings. He may have heard the noise from the tunnel collapse and come to investigate, flashlight in hand. What he found, investigators believed, was something he didn't understand. 4 terrified teenagers in shock, their van stuck, 2 of their friends missing underground. Maybe they begged for help. Maybe they accused him of something. Or maybe he panicked at the sight of blood, at the chaos and the risk of being blamed. Whatever happened in those moments sealed their fates. The blood patterning on the tire iron matched the 4 victims found in the van. Forensics suggested the weapon was used in quick succession, blunt and deliberate. There were no signs of defensive wounds on the victims, only impact, as if they never saw it coming. Afterward, Griggs might have tried to hide what he'd done. He could have dragged the bodies back into the van, driven it closer to the quarry's edge, and rolled it down into the basin while the water levels were low. Later, perhaps days or weeks later, he returned to seal the tunnel, burying the evidence, the bodies, and his guilt beneath concrete and time. By the end of that summer, Griggs himself had vanished from town. Records showed he sold his truck, cashed his final paycheck, and left without notice. He resurfaced years later in a different county, living quietly until his suicide in 2011. His death had gone unnoticed by most, just another footnote in a life that left little trace. When the storm came 17 years later, it tore away everything he'd built to hide what happened. The floods washed out the sealed concrete, collapsed the ridge, and drained enough of the quarry to reveal the van, his final attempt at concealment undone by the weather. The quarry itself, indifferent and ancient, had simply waited. Detective Mark Ellison was the one asked to narrate the official case summary for the families, though he'd already memorized every word. In the report, the phrasing was clinical: probable sequence of violent altercation, secondary concealment by third party, final recovery, and identification complete. But when he stood at the overlook, months later watching the families gather one last time, he understood that no paper could translate what this meant to them. The parents stood in silence along the fence line, the same place they had once stood with candles and missing posters. Now they stood with flowers. The quarry below had been declared a restricted memorial site, but for this day the gates were opened. A small group walked down the slope, their shoes sinking into the soft earth where the storm water had receded. They placed the flowers in the shallow pools that still remained, watching them drift slowly toward the center. For some, it was closure. For others, it was a wound reopened. A few still refused to believe the story as presented. Some insisted the teens were victims of something darker covered up, mishandled, simplified to spare the town its shame. Ellison didn't argue. He had learned that the truth, once unearthed, rarely healed anyone. It only stopped the guessing. He stayed behind after the families left, standing alone at the water's edge. The surface was calm again, faint ripples reflecting the overcast sky. He thought about how much of his life had been spent chasing ghosts in this place. How many nights he'd stood here with no answers, only questions that wouldn't let him sleep. Now that he finally knew, it didn't feel like resolution. It felt like confession, one that came too late for anyone to bear witness to it. The official memorial plaque went up that winter, bolted into stone near the overlook. It listed 6 names, all in the same font, the same line. In memory of the Miller Quarry, 6 lost. June 2008, found 17 years later. The story was over, at least on paper. The town moved on. The news cycle ended. But for Ellison, the quarry would always feel alive in a way he couldn't explain. Sometimes, when rain hit the valley and the wind carried just right, he imagined he could hear faint echoes rising from the basin. Not voices, not words, but something softer, like the weight of memory itself settling back into silence. The storm had taken many things from Mill Creek that summer: roads, trees, homes, but it had also given something back: the truth. And in the strange, quiet way time works, that truth had always been there, waiting beneath the surface for someone patient enough, or haunted enough, to find it. For years afterward, flowers would still appear on the ridge every June. No one ever saw who left them. Maybe a parent, maybe Ellison himself, maybe someone who just couldn't stop thinking about how easily the earth can hide what we're not ready to face. And with that, the Miller Quarry finally fell silent again, not peaceful, but still, the kind of stillness that comes when the story has nowhere left to go.